you ever get the feeling television isn't what it used to be?
So no.
Brexit means Brexit.
We had to take a compulsory course called Combat Propaganda.
Boris Johnson once declared that his life's ambition was to be king of the world.
Does Yevgeny Lebedev have any connection with the Russian spy machine? Well, yes.
Find deeply offensive. Where is the evidence?
I don't care if they find it offensive.
The fundamental problem with Facebook is that it is accountable to no one.
The government was advised to invest money in the NHS. The government aren't listening to the evidence.
The kind of world I want to bring my child into.
And it's Friday night with Byline Times. I'm Peter Jukes.
And I'm Hardeep. And over the next hour, we'll be bringing you what the papers don't say.
And what the TV doesn't tell you. Now, but there's one bit of news we can't ignore, and that is the death of Prince Philip, who was, you know, a friend, a father to people, and we must mourn his death for their sake. And also, it is a momentous time for this nation in that Prince Philip has been a prince consort for 69 years, and this crosses over from our back to World War II and our role as a nation in search of, which used to have an empire in search of a role. We'll be coming back to that story in subsequent weeks when we've had time to digest the news and not covering just what the other channels and TVs are doing. Our front page, if we turn to that, nods to the death today with marking our losses. That's our front page on Byline Times today. But it also looks to the number of coronavirus deaths in this country, around about 150,000, depending on how you calculate them. And the demands for a public inquiry, and a proper public inquiry, as Brian Cathcart asked. But that's not our topic for today, is it, Hardeep?
No, today we're going to be focusing on racism in Britain, which since we last did this show, there have been several developments, mainly around a controversial report that was published by the Commission on Racial and Ethnic Disparities, which found that actually in modern Britain today, institutional racism does not exist.
Well, we have 3 reports on that on the website, and we had great to have as our guest tonight, Lord Victor Adebowale, who is going to talk to us about various issues that come from the race report and the events of the last 2 weeks. But first, we must first tell you that we are an independent news channel. We're not GB News. We're not funded by hedge funds. We don't have a license fee. Maybe we should start one. And the way our license fee is you. That's basically if you subscribe to our channel on Patreon, you fund all this amazing studio, these wonderful guests, and all the other programs we do. You can do that by going to patreon.com/Byline TV. That's patreon.com/Byline TV. And keep us going, keep us honest, and be our proprietors. But when we talked about the race report, which we'll do later, this issue about racism and institutions came up before the race report was published. And that was particularly around the issues after the interview with Meghan Markle and Harry on Oprah Winfrey about allegations of racism in our press. In a moment, I'll be talking to Dominic Ponsford, the chief editor-in-chief of the Press Gazette. I want to be an editor-in-chief, I'm only executive editor, about his changing responses to those allegations of institutional racism in Britain's media. And it's a very interesting story. He initially pushed back a bit, but has published some articles and seems to have gone on a bit of a journey, which he'll tell us about. But the initial response was not good from key figures in the press. And we'll now see the former head of the Society of Editors, Ian Murray, talking to Derbyshire on BBC Radio 5 Live, was it, or BBC, on BBC News, his initial reactions to the accusation of racism in Britain's press.
Themselves. Can I ask you about those headlines again? The Star asked whether Harry would be marrying into gangster royalty.
I'm not going to defend one headline.
Sorry, Mr. Murray, you just told me. Excuse me. Please, may I speak? Please, may I ask the question?
The huge amount of coverage.
Mr. Murray, you can continue talking over me, but I want
1 or 2 examples and say, look, here's something that someone might point to and say, so therefore that means that
you told me, Mr. Murray, you told me the British tabloid press was not bigoted. I've just given you some examples. You're denying that those examples are racist, and I'm asking, why are you denying that?
Well, and I'm making the plain to Victoria that what we're saying, and I'm not defending individual things here and there. I'm looking at the whole thing. When you say that someone might make one comment about something, and I'm not saying whether those were bigoted or racist at all.
Well, let me ask you, as the Society of Editors...
I never get the chance to actually finish, Victoria, my point. When you actually label someone as bigoted because of one example that is disputed, and actually say, and not taking the whole thing in the context and saying, look at the way that they have covered it, I'm afraid that's the, if you keep on looking, you will find that needle in the haystack.
Right, but you just told me that the British press isn't racist, and now you're saying if you keep on looking, you will find a racist needle in the haystack. So let me ask you again, are those headlines racist? Simple yes or no?
I'm not going to stand to defend and say whether they are not. What the context is,
You're the Society of Editors.
Sorry, Victoria, you know full well, because you are a journalist, you've got to see the context.
Well, let me give you some context then, please.
Out of things, and I'm not saying whether they are
right.
or they aren't.
Well, let me give you some context.
So, Dominic, thanks for coming in the Lion's Den or Byline TV from your location at home. So that first reaction from Society of Editors, we must say that many members of the Society of Editors disavowed Ian Murray's statement that they sort of pushed back against racism in the press. But was your sense, I remember you saying at the time that the problem about this sort of attack on the partiality of the press was that journalists are put under more pressure and threat. Do you feel you understand why Ian Murray resigned, why people, and do you think you've changed your mind since that initial statement of yours?
Yeah, so I could sort of, I remember at the time I could understand why Ian said what he said, because I guess he felt he had a duty to defend the industry in his position, which I guess is a sort of similar duty that I feel sometimes. But at the time, although it's easy to say this now, I did feel that it wasn't the right thing to take such a serious accusation and just say, no, it's not true. It felt like the right thing to do is to think about it a bit before you respond. I think my initial response was that I felt, I think I said that I felt that Prince Harry was giving us the tabloid media a sort of blanket accusation of bigotry that I wasn't sure that you should sort of accuse everyone of being bigoted. And I think you know, at the time it felt that there was it did lead to a lot of anger against journalists
really, you
on social media.
How was that anger expressed?
Just sort of thousands and thousands of you know, kind of an explosion of a sort of abuse on Twitter, really. So I guess that kind of made me get a little bit defensive, but I did sort of say at the time, look, we need to think about this and investigate it a little bit. Let's not sort of, you know, because it's too serious a thing really to kind of just deny.
That's very interesting, you know. So your initial reaction, a bit like Ian Murray's, was you felt you need to defend an industry. But then you felt the sort of Twitter attacks were quite personal against journalists. Is there a movement in people's heads? I mean, this will relate to what we'll talk about later, the race report, that talking about racism isn't necessarily like the press being racist. Doesn't mean the individuals within it are racist, but there could be structural things. Would you see that's a difference now from the way it could have been interpreted, what Harry and Meghan said?
Yeah, I mean, and maybe that's a mistake that people make. That they take it very personally, that they take a sort of an accusation of bigotry as saying that you're bigoted. When I think that's one of the things. So I guess we'll come on to it. We did a big survey of our readers to see what they think, and I think one of the things that's come out of it is it's not necessarily about individuals being racist, but it's about it's about looking at the coverage and looking at the things that are written and looking at the way that coverage is perceived and the way it makes people feel.
Yeah, let's go into it, Dominic. Let's go into it, because you did a survey of your readers. Because your sense was, just to explain for people, that was that this was getting quite personal. But then, to people in your industry and journalists, as I know, as a new journalist, they do get attacked quite a lot. But what did that survey show?
So we thought if we're gonna get into this, so we're gonna respond to it. Let's find out what the readers think, because certainly a couple of sort of email messages I got from people actually saying, look, there's something in this, and obviously there's a lot of people distancing themselves from Ian Murray. So we emailed our 10,000 newsletter subscribers and asked them a sort of few questions, really. We asked them whether they thought the UK media was bigoted or racist in any way. We asked them whether they thought the coverage of Meghan was racist or fair. And we asked them whether they'd experienced or witnessed racism in the newsroom. And I've got to say, the response was flabbergasting. I mean, it really was. So we had 1,000 people fill out our survey.
That's a lot.
So out of
10%'s a lot on an email thing like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, who fills out online surveys? Like, no one does, do they? Yeah. Like, what a bore. So the fact we've got 1,000 people just get straight back to us, I thought, crikey, okay, people feel strongly about this. Yeah. So obviously, a statistician will tell you that's a self-selecting sample.
Yeah.
But it's still 1,000 is a decent sample, I'd say. So 721 of the people that got back to us were journalists. The rest were non-journalists. And of the journalists who got back to us, 2/3 of them said they thought the media was bigoted in some way, and they said not just the tabloids.
2/3 said they thought the media was bigoted, not just the tabloids. And what were the other two questions that you asked them and their responses to those?
So I asked them about the Meghan coverage, whether they thought it was fair. Most people said they thought it was unfair. They thought she's had too much negative coverage. Now half of them, which I was quite surprised about, half of the journalist respondents said they thought the Meghan coverage was racist, which is did that surprise you?
Why did that surprise you? The Compton line and various things about her background.
Yeah, I mean, it did surprise me because I think looking at the coverage, I mean personally, but I'd say this with the caveat that I'm not an expert on what's racist, what isn't, for obvious reasons. But I didn't see coverage myself that I thought was overtly racist. The straight out of Compton, almost straight out of Compton story. Yeah. When I read that, I read it as the sort of rags to riches story that the press will always do. That's like one of 5 stories 5 or 6 story types that the press will always try and look for that rags to riches line. I think it was like inaccurate, wasn't it? Because
her mother lived nearby, but not that quite well to do. But Compton, Americans, funny thing is, American readers would see that immediately as race. But we'll be talking later about race and class and things like that. But do you think it was the volume of coverage, mainly negative, she attracted, which even if itself wasn't explicitly racist, the fact it was so consistent and aggressive could have felt to some people like that was racist?
Yeah, I think, the things people said was that things like they felt that it was motivated by someone who didn't know their place, or someone who had kind of got above her station in some way, and I think they felt that they felt it was racist. So you can't argue that. And what's interesting is that the vast majority of ethnic minority and black respondents thought it was racist, and it goes down to a much lower amount when it's white people like myself. And one possible explanation of that, which I think one respondent came up with, which maybe rings true, is perhaps people of my generation, people like me, brought up to have a sort of colourblind view of the world, to say that say that racism isn't something we think about. It's just not a thing. And maybe that leads you, to not seeing things, and maybe that leads you into bad places in terms of perhaps in other ways. So
that's very good that you've done this analysis, the self-analysis, and of the industry. In a way, what you're saying, I'm going to use the dread word woke, there is a sense from that one has to wake up to these realities, especially our generation, our background, and we just don't see them unless people explain them to us.
Yeah, and I think with the straight out of Compton story, which I personally didn't think was racist when I read it, but it was mentioned by about 40 people who responded to our survey that they found it offensive, they thought it was racist. So once they've said that, you've got to take that on board, haven't you? And it's not a question of what I think. It's a question of like not offending a large proportion of your readers, isn't it?
Yeah.
So
if victim of racism is more aware of it than somebody who's just a bystander. And then you wrote this piece. Well, you commissioned this piece after that report from Liz Gerard, which just takes us to the kind of final point on this, because we will be covering these other issues about racism later in the show. Liz Gerard, who sometimes writes for Byline Times too, was a sub-editor at the Times for many years. I wouldn't say a Fleet Street hack, and obviously Fleet Street doesn't exist as a location, but a long experience in the business. And she's tracked, at the end, she tracks the lack of employment of people of colour in the industry, particularly in any senior position. But that seemed to change her mind too, the volume of front pages about immigrants, about Raheem Sterling, about Meghan, about Muslims. Did that change your mind at all? Was that a shock when she sort of went through that?
Yeah, well, I guess I thought, I just don't have the time, right, to read all this stuff, to look at these thousands of stories. Let's commission Liz, who I know is very good at that. She wrote this huge sort of 5,000 word analysis of press coverage going back sort of 10 years around Europe and other things. And yeah, just assemble, it was brought together a lot of things that I was aware of, but when you assemble it all together, there are a lot of things there which aren't good. So there are things like, the press for a long time was much more likely to write negative stories about Muslims than positive ones. It was much more likely to get stories wrong when writing stories about Muslims when compared to other people. If you take Europe and coverage of sort of foreigners in single quotes, then there's a lot of negative coverage about Europe and foreigners in the run-up to the referendum, which with hindsight is not good, and I guess that would probably fit into a good definition of bigotry. So there are a few things there which when you look at it, you say, well, okay, you can't look at all that stuff and then say the press isn't bigoted, can you? Now, in my position, I don't think I would sit here either and say the press is bigoted, but I would say there's something worth looking at here, and I guess that's why I did change my mind a bit in Prince Harry from initially feeling quite defensive to like thinking now, I think, well, actually Prince Harry's done us a favour because he's really forced us to take a look at this, and in the context of the wider debate you're having about racism in the UK, it's prompted us to think, well, the media is an institution that's got an awfully long way to go. I don't think we've even really started thinking about it, to be honest. And if Prince Harry's prompted us to do that, then we kind of he's done us a service, really. So I've kind of shifted my view somewhat.
Well, that's brilliant, to be honest about shifting your view and also opening up those difficult conversations. But I don't want to. You put that very eloquently. Before we close, though, just one thing. I mean, I met you, I think 7 or 8 years ago. I think you might have given me an award once, and then Piers Morgan the next year. And I think Piers Morgan had revealed then, before you became editor, that he used to own Press Gazette. So, but you have a longer association, is that you knew Alistair Morgan, hero of Untold, the Daniel Morgan story, the murder of his brother, and the forthcoming Daniel Morgan report, which will be out next month. You've known him for a long time, haven't you?
Yeah, so he wrote a piece for us. So he started his career, as you know, as a journalist, and then and it's through a mutual journalist friend that I know Daniel quite well, and he wrote a piece for us in 2011 about the murder of his brother, which started to get into some of the very lightly around some of the concerns about links between private detectives and tabloids and so on. So yeah, I've known Daniel for a long time, and it's a sort of it's great the way you've championed that story. It's the sort of it's a massive kind of scandal, isn't it? Well,
it made Line of Duty, so we're famous now. It was mentioned in Line of Duty, the BBC series. The panel report, as I said, hopefully I'll see you there and report. There'll be a lot to report then. Apparently not. Well, we'll have to see what happens. Does it make? Sorry.
I was going to ask you really, because you're more on top of it than me, but I don't think we've still really got to the bottom of it, have we? I mean, in terms of the connection between the News of the World and all those.
My lips are sealed. We'll have to see what the panel says, though. Obviously, it only have powers of subpoena over public institutions and not over News UK. But just one last question on this, because we've had various debates about press regulation, between us disagreements, and obviously I'm sort of outside the industry looking in, and you have to represent that industry. But do you, and I've spoken to other people in your position, do you regret there not being a Leveson 2 in a way, not about regulation, but just to clear the air about some of the crimes? Do you think that is now not overdue, but that has been a missed opportunity for some truth and reconciliation?
I think from the point of view of journalistic criminality, I feel that was really, really well explored by the police. If you look at the, I think it was more than 100 journalists who were either arrested or questioned under caution, and quite a few stood at trial, and quite a few went to prison as well. But I think the thing that wasn't really explored by Leveson, which deserves to be explored, is the connection between corrupt policemen, corrupt police officers, corrupt journalists. The police kind of got off scot-free, didn't they, in Leveson 1, and that was kind of the whole. That was the whole thing, point, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was the whole point of it. And it was supposed to. It was only delayed because they couldn't contempt the trials that were forthcoming. But that's a very good point. And just as a point of interest, one of the reasons Alistair Morgan accepted a panel inquiry like Hillsborough that has no powers of subpoena as other bodies was he thought that would come up in Leveson. Well, look, we'll have to talk to you again on the show sometime soon about these issues, Dominic. Thanks for coming and talking to us and being so open about your journey.
Yeah, well, you're very welcome. I'm on a journey. I'll see where it takes me.
Okay, great. See you soon.
Cheers. Bye.
So now we'll talk to Lord Victor Adebowale about wider issues of racism. But before we do, we have a short exclusive preview of a film, haven't we, Hardeep?
We do, yes. Earlier this week, Dawn Butler spoke to a number of people who had participated and are named in the report of the Commission on Racial and Ethnic Disparities. She found out what they thought, and here's an exclusive preview.
I think that the question that is the most interesting from the report has nothing to do with the report, but the people that sanctioned it. The black and brown people that did it. I think that what I find really interesting is like the weaponization of identity, the way that like some groups that kind of aren't really advocates of, let's call it, the rights of minorities or racial justice, progress, whatever kind of benign term I can come up with so they don't say I'm calling them racist. But like how they're using people from our own communities to then say, look, we're not racist. We created a commission where I think like 95% of the people on the commission were black and brown. This is what you people told us.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I think that you're
but
seeing
that's not, but isn't it okay for somebody who is black or brown to have a different experience and to say, well, actually, I've never suffered any discrimination or racism in my life, and look at me, I am the Minister for Equalities.
You know what? It's absolutely fine for someone to say that. If that's their own lived experience, absolutely no problem whatsoever. The problem is, though...
So isn't it your fault, Michael, because you need to overcome You need to overcome your issues and your problems. You need to run through that open door and grab your opportunities and pull yourself up and by your bootstraps. You need to do that. So what is the problem? If somebody can become the Minister of Equalities by doing that, why can't you?
My lived experience is entirely different, and as is the lived experience of most people of African, Caribbean and Asian heritage in this country. And, you know, don't take it from me, look at pretty much every other report that's ever been commissioned on this.
But isn't that your fault? Is that because it's your mentality, because it's the way you're thinking? You're always thinking somebody's against you. You're always thinking they're racist. You're always thinking, you know, that's happened to me because of the colour of my skin.
Yeah,
so
so stop and search happens to me because of what I think. The fact that there are 0 black people in C-suite positions on the FTSE 100 companies, that's also got to do with the way that I think. The fact that black children, totally contrary to the report, are doing so badly in schools is also to do with what I think. The fact that banks don't give us money to start businesses, that's also to do with what I think.
Oh no, but that's also to do with where it's placed. And so,
I forgot the geography
because
argument.
The geography of where businesses are placed is why black businesses are not doing so well.
Well, interestingly, most people of African and African Caribbean heritage actually live in the southeast. The southeast is the most prosperous part of the country. So I'm not quite sure how that argument applies to them.
Do you know something?
But this report says it though.
You know something, Dawn? You know, the one word that comes to mind is it smacks of colonialism. That is it. You know, these things are always put in place to divide and rule, so that actually we've not moved too far away from pitting black people against each other in terms of, you know, what they can amass for their own agendas and then what the others get. This is no different to any of that for me.
Yeah, I was watching Black Judas, or Judas and the Black Messiah, and it kind of just, it's true, like in the days of slavery, you know, they had the house people and the field people. And, you know, I feel like I'm not casting aspersions on anyone, but, you know, to Michael's point, like, yeah, I grew up in the Bronx, a Jamaican immigrant, which apparently is like the lowest group or whatever, but went to Yale and did well and have a good life. It doesn't mean that I didn't experience racism. It just means I overcame it. Like, so I think that this notion
that's what
that
the report says, you've got to overcome.
Yeah, you have to overcome
it. Why can't everyone just overcome?
Because the thing is that, like, what...
The big question is, how do you overcome something that it claims doesn't exist?
Yeah.
I'm just saying what the report says.
Because according to the report, this stuff doesn't exist.
I can only take this argument so far with what I've got in front of me.
How do I overcome an institutional racism that actually isn't really there?
Well,
yeah,
according to the
report, about this before as well, Dawn, which is that, like, the title of the commission was Race and Ethnic Disparities, but then the conclusion is that none of the disparities have to do with race or ethnicity. So it's almost.
So did any of your recommendations include racial disparities, and were they removed?
Yes, the British Business Bank report says that race is statistically significant, I think, or something like that, is the language that they use as a factor in determining outcomes, which basically means that systemic racism exists.
So they whitewashed your findings. They took all the race out of the...
I think that's why it went down to 4 pages instead of, you know, a larger section.
So all the race stuff that would maybe have leveled up the race got removed from your submissions.
Yeah, it wasn't, the report doesn't look like the conversations that I felt like I participated in.
And we're joined by Lord Victor Adebowale. Victor, thank you so much for coming in and
thank you.
Chatting to us.
Nice to
I mean,
see
the race report has obviously been very controversial in its findings. What are the biggest taboos that remain in Britain talking about race and class today, do you think?
Well, taboos. I don't think there are any taboos. I think there are some things that are... Race, full stop period, is a taboo in terms of talking about it. and having an open conversation about it. There are big taboos, and there are ways in which we talk about race which are designed to avoid actually talking about it, if you see what I mean, because they're accusatory. You know, you are a racist, you're not a racist. And it's also about who's doing the talking. So I think we're not comfortable talking about race in this country in a way that's open. And I think until we can have that conversation, the whole thing remains something of a taboo.
I mean, it's interesting, nearly 30 years after the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence happened, and in the wake of that, Sir William Macpherson's report into the handling of the murder by the police said that, we'll coin this phrase, institutional racism.
He did.
And people being treated differently based on their colour, their race, in terms of attitudes, and that could manifest in terms of thoughtlessness, i.e. racism is not always about intentionality.
No.
It's about sort of the water we swim in.
Yeah, it doesn't make it less racist, though.
No, exactly.
I mean, I'm not a fan of the notion of unconscious bias, or indeed unconscious bias training, since if you are being biased, it's happening to someone, and it's certainly not unconscious to that person. So I'm a bit, I think there are all these terms that are used that actually are about avoiding just talking about the impact we have on people and the judgments that we make because of the colour of the skin or their religion, race, gender, whatever. Those are the issues, and the future's decided by the things that you don't discuss, not the things that you do. So it creeps up on you, and it becomes a dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that last year, after the murder of George Floyd in America, and obviously the protests that swept cities across the world, the Black Lives Matter movement grew in the UK, and Boris Johnson announced this sort of government-appointed commission that would be looking at racial and ethnic disparities. But the government was quite keen to say that it would be looking at outcomes across a range of groups, including, in its own words, the white working class. Yeah. And the outcome of this report is that the differences many times cannot be explained by racism. I mean, what do you make of that, this notion of...
Well, I'm sure that some things can't be explained by racism. I guess I thought it was a bit odd if you look at the... you have the death of George Floyd, which, by the way, wasn't the first death, but it's the one that shocked because it was basically filmed on TV in broad daylight. And then you have a report that says it's about looking at race, but then says it's not looking at race, or it's looking at the issues, the dynamics that might lead to that kind of, do we have a problem? Black Lives Matter was all about black people saying we do have a problem. Black Lives Matter here too. And there have been deaths in police custody that clearly have a racial element to them and racist attitudes to them. And they were saying that Black Lives Matter. And there's a difference, it's subtle, but it's important, between saying we're going to look into why black people feel the way they do, let's examine what that's about and what the truth of it is, versus saying we're going to look at all the dynamics of all the races, and in particular the race that black people are saying is oppressing them.
That's the Jonathan
Portis. It kind of changes the argument subtly, but quite deliberately.
Jonathan Portis says that wasn't actually looking. He's a great writer, and written, as he said, in 35 years of writing and reading government reports, he's never seen one discredited so quickly.
It's Jonathan Portis.
It's Jonathan Portis.
The Economist.
He writes. So he writes
about
it. He said it wasn't looking for that, and wasn't looking for correlations on.
Well, anybody who does anything, any research, it's all about the question. If you ask the question, it tends to dictate the answer or the way you go about looking at the question. And so the question was in itself designed to produce certain outcomes.
But why, in your opinion, why did the government make this report as wide as it did, i.e. looking at all groups rather than just
I think there's
minority groups?
Yeah, there's two answers to that. The first is that there is a genuine belief that you can't look at race outside the dynamics in which it exists. It's not. So you have to look at the whole thing. That's one way of looking at it, and you could say, well, you know, and the other way is actually we don't really believe in the things that Black Lives Matter are saying. You know, Black Lives Matter protests was about systemic racism. It was about structural racism. It was about the impact of those things on individuals, which lead to deaths. So, you know, if you want to know what structural racism is, it's a black man being strangled on the street by a policeman who doesn't see that person, that black man, as a human being, who has been educated out of seeing the black man as a human being, who works for an institution that discourages him from seeing that black man as a human being, and works for a system that's permissive about that institution giving. That's systemic racism. It results in that black person. If you want to see that, it's not difficult. You can work it out, right? But you can deny that. You can say, well, actually, it's just an incident. It just happened because, you know, that copper was having a bad day, and he is a racist, but, you know, it's nothing to do with the police, nothing to do with the system in which the police exist, nothing to do with the government, nothing to do with any of that. If you do that, then it takes away responsibility. It makes it an episode rather than part of a system. And that's tempting if you're the government. I can understand why. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to see that you might be tempted to avoid looking at the possibility that you might be responsible for this, that the leadership might have something to do with this. I think that temptation was taken, frankly.
And one of the other sort of interesting points about all of this is that when the members of the commission were appointed by the government, and a number of the sort of prominent names have been people who'd been on record before saying that they didn't really buy into this notion of institutional racism. And interestingly, as we saw in the clip with Dawn Butler, this notion of a commission consisting of people of colour, then sort of concluding that institutional racism doesn't exist. I mean, it's quite an interesting dynamic.
Well, again, you know, I'm sure the government would say, well, they will look at other commissions and say, well, those people were drawn from people who believe that systemic and structural racism exists, so they believed it exists, and so they found it. So what we did was take a load of people who were sceptical about it, at best. And lo and behold, we didn't find it. Right? You've got to be careful. I mean, I've read the report. I've read it. It's 236 pages, right? And even if you have read it, you don't remember it, right? I've read it quickly. I've read about 100 pages deeply. You've got to be careful, because it doesn't say that structural racism doesn't exist, nor does it say that racism doesn't exist. In fact, it says the opposite. It doesn't say that systemic racism doesn't exist. In fact, it says the opposite. What it says is that they found little evidence for it, and then they say that young people who use these terms are foolishly, it doesn't use the word foolishly, but are in error, that they are somehow, it's well-meaning, but they're wrong. Of course, it's not just young people that use it. I mean, some of the anger in the report is because of the sort of the patronising style. It's like, it's not just young people, professors, researchers, academics, quite a lot of them, use that term quite rightly, because it's a well-researched dynamic in societies. It's not because they're stupid. It's not because and in saying that they didn't find evidence of institutional and systemic racism, they failed to define what they meant by it, and they failed to give any evidence of what it does look like if you were to find it. So it was just left. It's just blank. We found no evidence of it, but yes, but what do you mean by it, and what would it look like if we did find evidence of it? And so you need to be careful. And I think some of the comments, some of the critique of the report is playing into an argument, quite a dangerous argument. If you haven't read the report, you haven't examined it, but you're saying, it's denying that racism exists, the response will be, well, no, we never denied that racism exists, which is true, they didn't. They didn't deny that racism exists. In fact, they made exactly the opposite statement. But it's the way they did it. It's quite subtle, and I think it's quite important that the responses to the report are thought through, and I've been disappointed by some of the attacks on the commissioners, which are just uncalled for. It's like, it plays into the hands, I guess, if you were to believe that there were a bunch of black or indeed white radicals out there who don't read reports but attack the people who write them. You're playing into their hands. It's like, at least read the report and have a view that's based on some understanding of what it's actually saying.
And what do you think some of the wider implications of the report and its sort of the headlines it's made, even if they are devoid of some of the reality of what it says?
It depends on who you are. So the audience for the report, I think, put it this way, you're in the business of news. You know that most people read the headlines. They might not read the rest of the story. And if they read the rest of the story, they might not examine whether it's true or not. And indeed, some people read the headlines and assume it's true. So the headlines, effectively, and this is what you hear, this is what I'm hearing, government denies racism exists. I mean, that's one of the headlines. That's one of the things that people think the report says. Or government denies that institutional or systemic racism exists. The problem with that is that it becomes a belief. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not, it's a belief. And you try and dissuade somebody from a belief. So there will be people out there either thinking, doing or acting on the basis that this report gives them permission to say to black people, what are you complaining about? There's no such thing. This report says so. It's a government report. Right? There'll be others who will look at the report and go, actually, this is part of a pattern of denial, and it's part of the same pattern of injustice to black people. And there'll be others who will see it as a divide of literally splitting behaviours. It's designed to split the black community. Some of the notions in the report, when it talks about, it's used the personal experiences of the commissioners, and I think the clip that you showed is interesting. I've done, I'm done all right. I'm a member of the House of Lords, for God's sake. What am I complaining about, right? Rock and roll, baby. But the fact of the matter is, I'm the exception that proves the rule. Yeah. Just as you are. There are very few.
Well,
black
it's really
people
interesting
in my
that
position.
When Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, was asked about the report, first he said he hadn't read it. At that point, I think he was doing an interview with ITV News anyway, and then he said, "Well, the things that happened to me when I was a kid, I can't imagine those things happening to me now, and therefore I think that shows the progress that we've made as a country." Which I just thought was such a small, striking example of this thing you're talking about, Victor, that success of the few doesn't eradicate the problem for the many.
Of course, but also it's not likely to ever happen to him now because he's in a chauffeur-driven car. No, it's a serious point.
Exactly.
It's not going to happen to him now. It doesn't mean it's not happening in Burnley, Bradford. Of course it happens. It happens all the time, every day, to millions of people. So the idea it's kind of unscientific. It's evidence. It's qualitative evidence, but it's not much. It's not grounded in something. And anybody can say, well, it hasn't happened to me, therefore it doesn't happen to anybody.
Yeah.
But that's nonsense, right? And I think you can bring in personal opinion, but to align it with fact. And then build a policy around it would be in error.
Well, the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, when she was interviewed by the Daily Mail after the Black Lives Matters protest last year, she said, well, I don't think Britain is a racist country because you wouldn't be sitting here talking to me as Home Secretary now if it was. And whenever sort of her views are sort of, or her punitive policies rather, are sort of challenged.
Yeah.
In terms of her being an ethnic minority herself, she always says, well, that's racist to say that I need to be a certain type of minority and have a certain type of view on these issues around inequality, which I find interesting because I think you can still have your personal experience and then look at the evidence and hear what is happening to others.
It's not, I mean, one of the interesting dynamics around race in this country and in America is the use of language, the redefinition of racism, the idea that a white middle class man can tell me that my experience of racism isn't racism. How would you know? It's the first. How would you know? Right? It'd be like me telling you that your experience of sexism, if you experience it, isn't true. I mean, who am I to tell you what your experience is? It's like it's almost the very definition of racism to take that view, and yet it's seen as and the language that we've used, this term of woke, which I find fascinating because I've yet to hear somebody say, well, what's the opposite of woke? Asleep. Well, I know which I'd rather be. You know, it's like, what an odd way to talk about these things. And it's become expected. I mean, your piece before about the press, I've yet to see a press, an article in any press that says, well, what's the opposite of woke? Which do we want to be?
You might have seen one on Byline Times, but
Byline Times. That's why I'm here. But it makes no sense. You know, this is you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see that it makes no sense.
And GB News, at least its main presenter and founder Andrew Neil said, was a kind of anti-woke campaign. But that's what I was wondering from both your point of view. Really, is this a abortive part of the culture war? I mean, I just must point out that the Mail cover it, and also the Times, as basically they got an executive summary, I think, before anybody else.
Yeah,
they led the headlines like whitewash would be the word I'd use, and white is that, oh, Britain's fine now.
Yeah, I mean, it's the wrong question, isn't it? So I was asked, is Britain a racist country? And my response is it's the wrong question. The question you should be asking is how racist is Britain? Not whether it's racist or not, because to argue that racism doesn't exist.
Well, it's all there or not there at all.
Yeah,
there's no degrees.
It's just nonsense. And indeed, the government's own report into the Windrush campaign, for instance, was excoriating of the Home Office, the very body that's supposed to protect people like me and you, British citizens. So it's just nonsense, and it's whataboutery. And the question that we ought to be asking is why. Why are we having this debate now in this way? What's
your answer to that question? Why?
I suppose the question I ask is what's really going on, because it is nonsense, right? It is a fictional debate, and I'm assuming that the people who write this stuff know that they know that it is not true. They know it is, and so the question is, what is it covering? And of course, we've had 150,000 people die as a result of a pandemic, the likes of which we have not seen in this country for a long, long time. The people who have died in that pandemic disproportionately have been black people, poor people, people who work on the front line. We had Brexit, which, whether you voted in or out, nobody can deny that it's had an economic impact. I mean, I think, come on, it is, our GDP has dropped as a direct result of a decision that we made. And these things will have consequences. And they're quite serious consequences that go on for a long time. Far be it for me to say that this debate is designed to avoid us looking at those consequences and who might be and what we expect of our leaders. I mean, that's not, but one might think that it might be a bit of a
Can I turn and ask you, Hardeep?
Canard.
Yes. What do you think it's about? Is it a part of a culture war? Is it a massive red rag to a bull to distract the bull from the picador throwing spears in his back? What's going on?
I don't know. I mean, I agree with what you say, Victor. I mean, I think it is stoking something as a means of cover for all of the reality. And as we've said, if you can't fight on truth and reality, you fight on myth and ideas and symbolism and these notions around identity, which I think do really grip more people and are more important to people than I think anyone really understands.
It raises passions.
But one question I wanted to ask Victor, though, was you are a crossbench peer in the House of Lords. How do you, in terms of... You're a black man.
What's it like?
You sit in you're Lord Victor Adebowale.
Yeah.
We were talking about race and class.
Yeah.
What has been, if I can ask, what's been your experience of
It's been a gas so far.
It's been a
gas so far. No, I mean, first of all, the House isn't sitting because of Corona, but I mean, as a general, it's been interesting. I mean, one can, people are surprised, I mean, people, I get three reactions really. One is, what's it like in the House of Lords, which is, I sometimes interpret as, what the are you doing there? What is going on, right? I'm not in Kansas anymore, and I have had some peers, refer to me in the past as, you're not a proper peer kind of thing, because, I'm not supposed to be. There have been black peers in the House of Lords, but not many, right? And then there's the
So,
people.
sorry, you're not a proper peer.
Yeah, because when I came in, you got to remember that there was the whole debate about hereditary peers.
Yes, and then the.
But just, you know, I mean, I don't look like a peer. I don't talk like, you know, I mean, and just this notion of what a proper peer is. You know, you are rich from wealth, and you know, I didn't expect to be there. You know, some people expected to be there from year high, right? So, you know, the proper peers, right? And some people feel that, you know, curiosity, a genuine curiosity about what I've done. Why am I there? You know, good question. Not quite sure myself, but you know, why am I there? And collegiate interest. You know, the I get on with my colleagues. Many of them are good people trying to do a good job. You know, in a wicked world, as it were.
But this notion of why are you there? Do you
Yeah.
feel that is that something that's been on your radar in particular? Or is that something that everyone in the House of Lords is kind of asked?
Everybody's asked, or should be asked why they're there, because I think you have a duty to be sceptical of those anywhere near power, right? But I think in my case, it's also about, you know, it is about this stuff. It is about, you know it is, right? And people say it. I mean, and there are racists in the House of Lords. I mean, you know, it's like any institution, it has racists in it. And I've met some of them, and they're not very nice people. But you know, and there is a view that the places like the House of Lords should be protected from the likes of me. I'm not supposed to be there, so what the hell are you doing?
But this is this a feel? I mean, this is the feeling that you
it's
get
a feeling
from
people
being
have
there.
said
Or they've expressed it. Really,
Yeah.
people have said these sentiments
I always tell
to
the
you.
joke. Well, I always tell the joke about my first day in the House of Lords and going into the Lords bar. I know I've told this joke so many times, but it just illustrates basically, you know, we can move on to bigger things. But I was sat in the bar, in the Lords bar, where only Lords can go. And there's another set of peers sitting around where you were, and two of them, and one of them turned to the other, and it just reminded me that those two old people in Spitting Image on the balcony.
Yes.
Yeah.
There wasn't Spitting Image, it was
now.
Sesame Street, wasn't it?
No, it was Spitting Image. There was two guys on the balcony always commenting on the show, and one of them turned to the other and said, "Good Lord, I'm not sure they're letting tourists in here." And it did make me laugh. There have been some other less funny comments, but that is the sort of, you know, it does shock people. There are people who are shocked by it, and some people are offended and shocked by it to this day.
And your response is, you
Well, it
shocked,
depends what I'm
offended?
Not really. Depends. You know, I mean, I've got better things to do. I get on with my day, you know. I found that particular incident quite funny, but people, some racists, there's a certain stupidity about racism, isn't there? Because it denies the person that you're being racist about, you know, intellectual ability. It denies them, you know, all kinds of things that they have. And in some ways it puts the racist at a disadvantage, which on occasion I'm happy to exploit. Right? I mean, it's not, you know, I'm not responsible for their racism. They are. You know? On other occasions, when I see harm being done because of racism, then I act. You know, I will say something, or I will take up the cudgel on behalf of the community. That's you know, I will use what authority has been given me to do something about it. I mean, the work that I did with the Metropolitan Police on their response to mental health, for instance, where we found that black people had a massive disproportionate likelihood of being killed if they had a mental health incident and were picked up by the police, or the work on stop and search, which indicated that still I am 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched than you are. You know, that's my response to it. It's actually, let's do something about it. Let's hold up the mirror to the institutions that we pay our taxes for.
And just lastly, following on from that very constructive sentiment, are there reasons to be hopeful? Victor, are you hopeful about our society, about issues like race, class, and despite these sort of setbacks?
Well, we haven't talked much about class, but it's interesting because the report, I mean, one of the things in the report, just to say, is this notion that it says, well, it's, you know, it should not about race, it's about poverty and overcrowding. But what it doesn't say is that black people tend to live in poor places that are overcrowded, which is a systemic issue, right? So it just wants to put that to one side. But am I optimistic? You know, I'm sitting here in a warm studio. It's, you know, I'm with friends. You know, I know you guys. I'm a huge fan of Byline Times. And I'm lucky enough to have been born with a decent brain, and I've got jobs. And do you know what I always say when people ask me that? I think I'm far too lucky to be pessimistic. Do you know what I mean? It's like everybody in this room is far too lucky to be pessimistic. The people that haven't got cause to be pessimistic are the people outside this room, you know, who are getting it in the neck while people tell them that it's their fault.
Well, thank you so much, Victor. Victor will be staying for our After Dark section. That happens in about 10 or 15 minutes' time. If you're happy to stay, we will serve beers. And that only happens for you clever people who join up and sign up to Patreon. That's patreon.com/Byline TV. For a little bit of money, like a cup of coffee or a small beer a month, you can join our after show Q&A with Victor tonight and most guests other nights. And more importantly, support independent media, which strives to answer to you, not to a proprietor, and to cover those issues. There are people out there, and our crew are often going out there finding what it's like outside our own little bubble, so that you keep us honest as well as paying us. So I think that's it for tonight, Hardeep.
Yes, thank you so much to Victor again
for
joining us, and thank you to everyone who has watched at home. We'll see you next week.
See you next week.